over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined here during our 11th season with Professor Joshua M. Myers, Associate Professor of Africana Studies in the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. He's the author of the book, We Are Worth Fighting For, A History of a Howard University Student Protest of 1989, published by New York University Press. Thanks for joining us today, Joshua.
Glad to be here.
Talk a little bit about the impetus of this book for you. I have to imagine you were likely an HU graduate.
I graduated in 2009 from Howard University, and in my last year there, I was actually involved in student government and student activism. And that's the first time I heard about the student protest of 1989. The student government campaign actually ran around that particular, sort of taking it back to that particular time. And so that August, April Silver and Ras Baraka were invited to come to campus to talk about the protest. And that's how I first learned about it. The next year, I met Akanke Washington in Philly when I went to graduate school at Temple, and she, as a Howard grad, had been involved in that protest. And so by the time I got back to Howard as a professor in 2013, they wanted to do a commemoration for the event, for the protest, commemorating the protest. And I kind of played the liaison between some of the people who were involved in the protest and making sure that we could do an event on campus. And after that event was over, Akanke asked me to write a foreword to a volume that they were actually preparing, composed of memoirs from people that were involved. For whatever reason, that project fell through. And at that point, I learned that this was an attempt that had been going on for at least 15, 20 years to write about this particular protest. And after that fell through, they approached me and asked me would I do the full book, the full volume. And I was like, I don't know. This is your story. I don't want to be the person who would impose my view on things. And so we had a really long conversation, Akanke Washington, myself, and April Silver, as well as a brother by the name of Jam Shakwi, about what it would look like to have someone from outside in many ways, but also inside in crucial ways as well, write about this particular protest. And so they gave me their archive, they gave me access to all of the people who were involved, and they actually even gave me an outline of what I should cover in this particular book. And, 5 years later, the book is out. So.
Yeah, when you think about Howard University in the 1980s, and just think about the names of people who came through there, who were students at one time or another. Everybody knows about Diddy. And of course, as you mentioned, April Silver. We could talk about a little later folks like Ta-Nehisi, Jelani Cobb, our new Democratic candidate for vice president. And of course, Chadwick Boseman, excuse me. But there's always been something about Howard University, right? About the institution and what it meant to Black America. Like in many ways, it's the crown jewel, right, of HBCUs and has been, for almost 100 years. Talk a little bit about what Howard University looked like in the previous decades before this moment in the 1980s.
Yeah, so a lot of the impetus for the protest was trying to reclaim or restore the energy of the 1960s on campus. And I think that's important. One of the things I do in the book, in fact, one of the things that they wanted me to do first, even before I was asked to write the full story, was to talk about the prehistory, because they saw themselves as part of a legacy. Mm-hmm. And so in the 60s is just one iteration of that. We can actually go back to really 120, 25 years ago to see some of the first student protests. But the 60s, of course, was a period where you see Black power emergent. Howard University has a huge role to play in that emergence, the Black university concept, the Black studies movement, all of those ideas, Howard plays a role in. Talk about the major moments in the history of Black studies, the Columbia University strike in New York in 1968. Many of the students who were involved in Columbia actually learned about how to take over the universities from Howard University. They actually went to Howard University to learn from them. You can talk about Nathan Hare and his role at San Francisco State. Hare start at Howard University. And so without saying too much, a lot of that Black studies and Black university sort of thrust comes from Howard and also other HBCUs.
Yeah.
But even at Howard, you have to go back to the early part of the decade when you see the Nonviolent Action Group, people like Stokely Carmichael and others that are grounded in that particular moment at Howard University. And their mentor is Sterling Brown. Sterling Brown actually is in many ways quintessentially Black studies. When you think about his sort of understanding of culture and art and questions of Black political identity, SNCC is able to go into the South and relate to the people from the South because they had been trained by people like Sterling Brown, Southern Black man at Howard in many ways. And so that part of it is often not told, which goes to show that this is a really continuous legacy because Toni Morrison was there at the same time as a professor, right? As a student, they were doing the same things in the 1950s. Remember, Baraka was doing the same thing in the 1950s. And so it's really a continuous thread that the students in the 60s just pick up and they take to different places. And the same thing was true in the 1980s when, dealing with the period of Reaganomics and that era in United States history, the emergence of neoliberalism and the emergence of hip hop. It's now a new moment to take that legacy to a different place. And that's what the protest represents.
Yeah, I was struck by some of the language you used to describe that 1960s period, like when the students began to campaign and become more activist-minded, that part of the challenge that they have is to make Howard Black, right? And it seems like an oxymoron, right? And an HBCU wouldn't be Black enough, but when you consider what the curriculum looked at the time, pushing the university to reflect both more the curriculum of what was happening in the world to Black folks, but also more of an engagement, right, with the Black community. And it seems to be a thorough line between those challenges in the 1960s and what we see in 1968. The leadership in the 1980s, the leadership that we have in the 1960s, the follow-up is a gentleman by the name of James Cheeks, right, who becomes, president of Howard in 1969, as you talk about. Talk a little bit about James Cheek and also talk about this interesting dynamic, and it's playing out even in 2020, of HBCU leadership and connections to what we might think of as conservative Republican politics, right, that are playing leadership in many of these institutions.
Yeah, so the Howard that I was just describing to answer your previous question is one side of the story, right? A lot of people like to talk about the two Howards, or the Howard of the community and Howard of the elite or the administration. That is very real, right? And so you have, among the Black elite, a very specific vision for how to advance the Black community. And then the community has its own self-determining vision. Those things clash constantly at Howard. And so in the 1960s, when they said we want to make this university Black, what they're actually saying is to reflect what most Black people feel about how we should move forward. Not this narrow elite idea that we can sort of represent the community by only educating a few of us, and relying on that educated few to represent our interests in whoever power is, right? James Cheek is right in the middle in many ways. So he emerges out of, obviously, an elite training. He is very highly educated. He very successful. He had been the president of Shaw University in his early 30s before he gets to Howard at the age of 36. And so it's a very strategic choice because he could relate to the students in ways that older Black leaders could not. And so as the story is told, he shows up on the campus, with the dashiki, with an afro, talking about Black diversity. And he really put it in place. You really understand Howard in the 1970s. There's a roster of Black faculty members that are directly recruited by James Cheek because one of the first things that he does is he recruits Andrew Billingsley to be the provost. And that's a really important moment, not just the history of Howard and HBCUs, but the history of Black people in the academy, because what Billingsley does with that post is he tries to literally create the Black university on that model that the students are talking about. So he brings in Ron Walters, he brings in Joyce Ladner, and we can go down the list. Hakeem Madabuti was the visiting professor at Howard at the time. Julian Mayfield, and the names just go on and on and on and on and on and on. Cecil James. I mean, it's really extraordinary to think about the 1970s, who was actually on the teaching faculty at Howard University. And so all of that to say that when the political winds shift with the emergence of, you can call it the new right or the neoconservatives, Howard is stuck because Howard has to figure out how to maintain its funding, because Howard is the only HBCU that receives money on appropriation from the federal government. And so by dint of the specter of police brutality, James Cheek had actually become a really important figure in the Republican Party. And so the brutal issues of police violence on HBCU campuses, and Leah Wright-Rigueur talks about this in her book, The Loneliness of the Black Republican. That moment leads to a number of HBCU presidents confronting President Richard Nixon about this particular issue. And Nixon responds, we still have HBCUs. Like, what do we need HBCUs for with integration? And so Cheek is like, of course we still need HBCUs. And so he gets this presidential appointment to really think about how to improve the government's federal relationship with HBCUs. And that insinuates him into the Republican Party. By the 1980s, when Reagan's the president, Cheek is a star in the Republican Party politics. Right. He gets the Presidential Medal of Freedom, right? He escorts Ronald Reagan to give a talk on the campus in 1982. In 1981, George H.W. Bush gives the commencement speech at Howard. And so this is a very logical progression of Republican Party politics. The only problem is Cheek was late in recognizing that this is not the Republican Party of the early 1960s, the Rockefeller Republicans.
Right.
This is a very different animal.
Right.
And so people like Ron Walters, for instance, recognized that, the great political scientist, because he led the protests in 1981 when George H.W. Bush came to campus. But others were like, wait, this is the new dispensation. We got to figure out how to secure our funding, so on and so forth. And so it's a very interesting moment. But when you see Lee Atwater emerge, that's like, okay, this is too much. So, yeah.
And the issue that really becomes critical for students in relationship to Dr. Cheek is a case of journalistic repression. Yes. Janice McKnight writing about a case of sexual assault on campus at the Hilltop, right? And we could talk about the whole legacy of folks who have come through the Hilltop. And that becomes this moment where students start to draw a real significant line around Dr. Cheek's leadership. Talk a little bit about that situation.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know about that protest, so thanks for bringing that up. It's really ironic because this is a figure by the name of Michael Harris, who is a freshman class leader in the 1968 protest. If you've ever seen the documentary Color is Black, yep. Michael Harris is the very militant young person saying, this is your last chance to negotiate with us. The next thing is revolution in the streets. And it was actually very real for them, right, in that particular moment. In 1983, Michael Harris is on the staff of the university, and he is the person that's involved in this lawsuit. And the Hilltop, being a journalistic outlet of really, in many ways, one of the best campus newspapers in the country, simply wanted to cover this issue. And the university decided to sort of say, nah, we're not going to allow you to cover this. And they actually expelled Janice McKnight, who, by the way, just made a transition last year. They expelled her, and the students responded by protest during Charter Day, then in the administration building. So the leader of that particular protest was the Howard University Student Association president, a figure by the name of Howard Newell, who is also important because he was actually cadre of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. He was sent to be vice president by the AAPRP. And so there's a very interesting connection. Of course, Kwame Ture, who was organizing the AAPRP, right, would come to Howard every year to recruit.
Right.
There's a lot of different moving parts with that particular protest, but at that point, Cheek was seen as a kind of absentee leader. They didn't see him as someone who was involved in the day-to-day realities facing Howard students. And that only increases throughout the decade. There's another protest in '86. In fact, Todd Shaw, a political scientist, is involved with this one, around the question of African-American studies, that we should support the department by making this course a required course for graduation. So there's a lot of stuff that leads, that's the apartheid struggle. that Kamala Harris talks about participating in on campus. All of that stuff is leading up to this moment in the late 1980s.
Yeah, and because you talk about what's happening, just broadly for Black students, right? And I'm one of those students at that moment where they're being drawn together by Jesse Jackson's presidential campaigns, in 84 and 88. You talk about the protests around South African apartheid and also demanding that institutions, particularly college campuses, right, divest, from South African country and businesses and what have you. And this great line where you talk about, for many of these Black college students in the 1980s, hip hop was their political grammar. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, because there's a way in which we always, in a de facto sense, think about hip hop as being political. Young folks don't necessarily think about hip hop in that way, particularly not about contemporary hip hop. But there was a way back in the 1980s, like the way that we talk through politics, right, was in fact through hip hop. So can you expound a little bit on that?
So it's a very profound thing when you think about it. And so hip hop scholars, of course, date this with the appearance of the song "The Message" and looking at the devastation of Black communities during that particular period. I largely agree with that, but without the anti-apartheid movement, we don't know how deep this would have went, because when you think about the appearance of Jesse Jackson in many ways on Stetsasonics songs, right, and connecting that issue to Southern African liberation, and then culminating in a number of different hip hop works. Something about the anti-apartheid struggle is what lends itself to this particular usage. And then by the time you get to, a lot of people will say, the beginning of the era itself, Yo Bum Rush the Show and Public Enemy's emergence and Boogie Down Productions, that anti-apartheid struggle is what energizes young people to then look at hip hop as a way, as a language or a grammar to sort of assert a political idea, a political ideology. And it's important because it was the only form in which people could sense their power. There's something about that assertion that was present in hip hop that wasn't present in so-called formal politics. And of course, we know how formal politics excluded so much from acceptable discourse. Richard Eitan writes about this in terms of the Black ethic. And so hip hop becomes a way, an avenue for us to express, the discontent in ways that don't look like how our elders would have us express it. In the 1987 meeting between young student activists, part of a formation called the National Black Student Unity Congress, and some of the elders of the 1960s, about what it looks like to be an activist, what does it look like to be politically involved. And that friction in many ways leads directly to the formation of Ras Baraka's response, which is Black Neoforce.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned, about that conference, the kind of tensions that went back and forth between Amiri Baraka, Ras Baraka's father, and a young Lisa Williamson, right, who we now know as Sister Soldier, over this real difference generationally about what was happening in that moment. So much of the story that you tell here pivots on folks reacting to a Republican Party operative, Lee Atwater. We'll talk about him in a moment. But what you also carefully frame is that these tensions were already there. Right, that there was actually, by the time Atwater becomes an issue, there's already an infrastructure there, right, amongst the students to respond, right, to that particular challenge. So talk a little bit about the founding of the Black Neo organization.
Yeah, so Black Neoforce, Black, of course, for identity is Black people, Nia, in terms of purpose, the Swahili term for purpose from the Nguzo Saba, and then Force being an acronym for Freedom Organization for Racial and Cultural Enlightenment. It's really the product of Ras Baraka trying to find an organizing vehicle for the kind of young people that were inspired by hip hop, but would not join a study group. Even though when you got into Black Neoforce, then it then became like you got to study too, right?
Right.
It wasn't like we're going to get together in the library and read books and then go pick it at first, right? It was about trying to translate this into an idiom that people like Diddy would be attracted to, right? Diddy was involved He was known as Puff then, right? But he was involved in early formation because he was part of a group called the New York Posse. And what they would do is they would arrange and throw parties. They would have rap battles and things like that. Just literally the iconic image that you get about the early days of hip hop. The New York Posse was involved in that. And of course, they were also involved in things that I couldn't write about in terms of what they were doing in the DC community in confrontation with other cliques in the DC community. And so, though it was a kind of, and many of these people are first generation college students too, right? So this element of the Howard student is not the stereotypical Black bourgeoisie. And so Black Neo-Force had to be a different animal, right? Because there were already organizations. There were groups called Black United Youth. There was Ubiquity. There were so many organizations, but Black Neo-Force had to be specific to this kind of student. And Raz was able to do that because I think because of his engagement with people like Lisa Williamson, Sister Soldier. A few years before, I think, or maybe 1 year before, during, he was involved in the Get Busy tour. Sister Soldier would have young Black college activists tour the country to really talk about what organizing is and try to organize on their local campuses. And it almost became incumbent on Raz to create something, but he wasn't alone. I don't want to make this a Raz Baraka organization, because it wasn't that. He was the person who was charismatic. He would recite poetry and speeches and get people into the room. But there were other organizers like Carlisle Seeley, like Chuck Webb, who in many ways handled the day-to-day of how to organize a student movement. And they were never officially recognized by the university, and that was by design. They wanted the freedom and flexibility to do things that were not authorized by the university. And at the same time, it became something that was connected to the Howard University student experience.
It's fascinating, right? Because again, when we go back to the late 1980s, more Americans know about HBCUs in that particular moment because it shows like a different world, right? And it actually helps generate an energy for young high schoolers who are thinking about where to go to school. And it seems like, in retrospective, right, it's almost a lost moment. The inability really to fundamentally build on some of that energy in ways that could have been more transformative. But of course, that brings us to Lee Atwater, right? And to start with Atwater, right, you almost have to accept it as a political operative for the Republicans. He was a genius at what he did. Evil genius, if you will. The way that he understood what the white electorate was at the time and the way that he leveraged their interest in older forms of Black music, right? So when you think about folks like B.B. King and all these kind of folks, playing at the convention, I mean, he was very savvy in that regard. And when George Bush is taking this hit, doing the campaign in early 1988, they go for the nuclear option, right? And we know him now, years later, as Willie Horton. What does it mean for a figure like that after Bush wins the election in '88, for Dr. Cheek to reach out to him to join the board of trustees at Howard University, right? On the one hand, it seems like maybe a savvy political move to have someone that was so well connected. At this point in time, Atwater is running the RNC. But it backfires on him, right? Because of this student protest infrastructure that's being built at the university. So talk a little bit about that situation.
Yeah. I mean, the students were very smart. I think Atwater, he was in fact very savvy. It's not like some of the Republican Party operatives today who are actually Wallace kind of formation of racism. We're going to be openly racist and obviously racist, right? It wasn't until the Horton ad that they showed their hands. It was much more subtle up until that point.
Right.
And so the students saw that. I mean, they could see that this was moving towards this particular kind of breaking point. This is before people had terms like dog whistle politics, right? Right. And so they understood those particular connections. And let's be very clear, it wasn't everybody. It wasn't all faculty. It wasn't all students that saw Lee Atwater as a problem because it was so subtle, right? And you had a certain segment of the student and faculty population that says, we're going to have somebody on the board of trustees that has direct, earshot.
Right. Absolutely. Right. Absolutely.
That's great. That's awesome. Right. And so we're taking I don't want to underestimate the risk or understate the risk that they took by taking this position against Atwater. It's less akin. I'm not telling my students it's almost like Steve Bannon going into the board of trustees, but it was less obvious to them, right? It would be a respectable form of Steve Bannon. So, like Carl Rosen, I don't know.
Right, I got you.
None of them are actually respectable to me, but
right, I got you.
They were able to see, the nuance of the situation. But the Horton ad, especially to these same, particularly young Black men who had faced the brunt of police brutality, not just where they were coming from in New York and Philadelphia, but also in DC, and understood what it meant to be branded as a criminal, like, and how that was ultimately undertone of that advertisement. It was a very obvious thing for them that this had to be opposed. But more than that, they did their research. And so they found how Atwater had been in many ways shaped by Strom Thurmond's politics. He had been involved in opposing Southern African liberation. I think that they had worked for Savimbi in Angola and all those different contexts. And so it was a very, very much a thing of this man is a problem. But as Raz would say, he's a problem, but he didn't create this problem. It's a whole ideology that we're trying to dispense with on campus. And one of the ways that they framed it was that there's issues of funding, but ultimately there's issues of the soul of this university, right?
Right.
If we go for the money that's there and there for the taking, what happens to what we do as a university, which harkens back, of course, to the question of whether or not we are a Black university, which was talked about in the 1960s.
When the students formally protest and issue a list of demands, what's striking is that the Atwater situation is last, right? It's so many other things, right? An Afrocentric curriculum, support for students to get college credit for the community service and community work that they were doing. Real questions about how financial aid was giving out, right? Concerns about the physical plant, right? The quality of the dorms and things of that nature. I mean, ultimately things that come down to be quality of life issues. Yes. That every student should speak out for, given the fact that they are in this context a consumer, regardless of who's paying for them to be there. And Atwater is really last to this conversation. I kind of like the cherry on top of the cake. How did the university respond, and Dr. Cheek in particular, respond to these demands?
So part of that, Mark, was it was tactical. We're not going to get a large majority of our students involved without looking at issues that directly face them.
Right.
And so before we throw on this complicated political question with the Atwater, we're going to link that issue, literally link it to the reason that we don't have a PhD program in African American Studies. We're going to link it to the issues of the university's relationship to the outside community. And then we're going to show how the same decision that leads to a political appointee like Lee Atwater is what leads to these quality of life issues. And so they were imbricated in very strategic ways. But the Atwater issue alone would not have gotten everybody into that building. Right. In fact, when that first night, there were like 24-hour sessions on Atwater. It's like, I don't know who Atwater is. Why are you here in the first place? It became consciousness raising in real time.
Right.
And
right.
That's what led. That's how it built. And so that's one thing. In terms of Cheek's response, he was, I don't know, angry is not a strong enough word.
Wow.
He was described by students who were in front of the negotiating table with him as almost more angry than an angry parent at that point.
Okay.
It's hard to replicate because I'm thinking about how the interviews that I did shifted once they got to Cheek. It
Wow.
was if
Wow.
this person was the enemy himself, as the students saw it, and it was as if he saw the students as the enemy, and that was really disappointing for a lot of the students, largely because they knew about Sheik's earlier years. They knew about how he had supported student activists and student visions in his earliest years, and they were just, in many ways, disappointed because he couldn't see it their way at that particular point. And so Cheek actually was interviewed by the Hilltop, and he went through every trope that you could think of, including the idea that these were outside agitators.
Right.
I mean, it was really problematic, his response. He felt that most students didn't care. Two, even if they did care, it's not their business who's on the board of trustees. Three, students are naive. They don't know how the university actually functions. They don't know the benefits that Atwater would bring. And the other part about it is Cheek was not physically well. And this might have been a fact that he was not running the day-to-day operations of the university at that point because he wasn't physically well. And so in many ways, this was it felt like a referendum on his whole presidency.
Yeah.
Which it really was. It was the next month he's resigning after another protest at his house. And so it was a really interesting sort of moment, but he never sees it. I think he went to his death not seeing what the students were fighting for.
Yeah. One of the key moments, is the occupation, right? And just from, knowing a little bit of the history here at Duke, there was a takeover of the administrative building back in 1969. And if you look at all of these campuses, right, there are these kind of moments, and every new generation of student comes in, new cohort of political student comes in, and they want their occupation moment. For those Howard students, it was this moment in 1989. And how did they manage that given some of the concerns they had about security, on campus and their interactions with both campus police and DC police?
The security issue is very peculiar. And I had to do a lot of thinking about this because, we're in a moment in a generation where campus police, they need to be disarmed. We don't know if we actually need them.
Right.
And so I had to really think about this, but the students saw them as regular staff members, campus police staff.
That's interesting.
And so not only regular staff members, but members of the DC community, which meant that their labor had to be protected. Their importance to us was in facilitating the relationship between the surrounding community and the campus, because they were part of that surrounding community. And so when their salaries were cut, or when they had issues in labor disputes at university, the students supported them in those particular moments, because they saw how important they were in the grand scheme of things and within the community. And so that translated into solidarity. The campus security, the campus police, actually have a sick out on the morning of the protest, which actually facilitates the ability of the students to take over the building. The same is true in terms of staff solidarity within the building, right? They decided that, hey, we understand and we're with you. And so they leave and they allow the students to take over the building. And so the administration, which was a metaphor for the time, was absent that morning. So it was, in terms of that part, it was easy. But DC police was a different animal, right? And so DC police, they saw the students as privileged, arrogant. They didn't see the issue in the same light. The police chief at the time, Maurice Turner, is notable. He would eventually run against Marion Barry as a Republican during that era. And so that kind of gives you how the police were thinking about this. And so There's a lot of people don't really know who actually called the police. Cheek claims he didn't, but everybody that I talked to basically says it was Cheek that calls the DC police. What we do know is that however they got to the chief of police who sends the SWAT team in, it didn't go through Marion Barry. And so they subverted the mayor. And over 100 police in full body armor and weapons show up on campus. Some of them came on via a helicopter, which landed on the roof. And as far as you could see of Georgia Avenue, there were paddy wagons ready to take these students away. They end up having to defend the building. Now, Black Neophors was inspired also by the Fruit of Islam and the Nation of Islam. Mm-hmm. And so they were actually trained in security. And so it was a very interesting dynamic. So they were able to hold off much of the assault, but it could not become a firefight, right? Right.
It couldn't be Wilson Good in Philly. Right. It couldn't be moved. Right. Yep.
Right. And so that was the problem. Had the students, used more than nonviolent tactics to defend that building, it would have been a massacre. It probably would have been a massacre anyway, but for Marion Barry. And so Marion Barry shows up largely because his deputy youth mayor, brother by the name of Kimry Hughes, actually shows up the day before to make sure everybody was safe, right? This is the importance of having Black people at the table, right?
Right.
And so he shows up, he says, I'm the deputy mayor. I want to make sure everybody's good, everybody's safe. And Black Neophors is like, oh, you represent the mayor? Oh, we don't trust you. You the government. Get out. And so the next day, when there's rumblings about, the police coming, which, had started them the night before because the university placed an injunction to sort of evict the students the night before, Monday night. Tuesday morning, it was like, okay, we didn't leave. It's still an injunction. What's going to happen? Kimry Hughes goes up to Marion Barry and says, you need to get to Howard's campus right now, because if not, you're going to have another Kent State. Right. And so Marion Barry gets into his car and they drive up right as the SWAT team is basically using a battering ram to basically penetrate the last line of defense. You had the entire football offensive line, the defensive line, and all the larger brothers in Black Neophors literally putting their bodies on the door, absorbing the blows of this battering ram.
Wow.
And Marion Barry shows up right as that's happening. Marion Barry shows up and says, hey, stop, leave those kids alone. And that's all it took for the police to stop. And so so when you talk about Marion Barry to students of that generation, oh, we don't got nothing to say about it. He said it all out.
Right.
And so, yeah.
But
also because he remembered, and he said this in the interview, I didn't interview him, but he was interviewed then by, I think, Jackie Trescott. He said, I was a student. I was in SNCC. I know what this means. Right. I know what to do. So.
Right. In the early 1990s, they start to talk about a new Howard, right? In the aftermath of all of this, what did this new Howard look like?
I would just directly quote April, who once they got the measured victory of Lee Atwater being, he actually resigned, but he was forced to resign.
Right.
Once they got that measured victory, they knew that now is the time to push. And so they used the word Afrocentric, meaning this university has to become representative of African people, right, intellectually, but also politically. Right. And so that meant for them, they wanted to do a number of things. One was to shift the curriculum. And so April is involved in the Afro-American Studies graduate task force. For them, we needed a PhD program in African-American studies, and we needed a center for the study of for the African diaspora, I think it was called. And when that is created, every other department, every other offering in this entire university should be infected by what we do in that space.
Right.
And so this becomes the center of the Afrocentric University, this intellectual thrust. The other things that they wanted to do was to deal with questions of Black institution building. We need to be able to give students the ability to create their own institutions in the community, because we know when we don't have autonomy over our own institutions, whether they be businesses, whether they be other kinds of institutions, churches, so on and so forth, and issues like Lee Atwater can come and infiltrate and use divisions to create these kinds of spaces. And then the third thing I thought they did was very ambitious, and that was to recreate a national student network, national Black student network. This has been going on in fits and starts since the 1970s, really since SNCC. But this national Black student network was a really critical part, because you know that, once the 89 protest happens and, it's preceded by others, go back to 86 in places, 87 in places like University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, Penn State, I think it was 88. But we know that there's a wave of protest that happens, going all the way up to like 1993, all over the university, in different kinds of universities. I write about this in one of the later chapters, that it seemed like after we wouldn't go 2 or 3 months without another protest during the early 90s. And so they wanted to create a network to support what these students were doing in their struggles against their universities. And so a new Howard meant something must shift, something must change as a consequence of this protest. It can't be what has been done in the past, which is we just wait the students out, wait till they graduate, and then we go back to what we were doing before. And something that I know interests you is probably the lasting contribution of these students, and that was the creation of the hip hop conferences that go from 1991. I think the last one was 1997 or 1996. And so that was one of the lasting things that lasted longer than the students who were involved in the protest. Right. What does it mean to actually have Howard become the intellectual center of hip hop studies and connected to the notion of self-determination within hip hop? The premise of that sort of movement was hip hop is not controlled by us, right? And so you actually have a bunch of hip hop artists, a bunch of hip hop executives come to Howard, and as a result, you start to get some taking back of control in the mid 90s. I don't know what you think about this, but my argument is, well, one of the quid pro quo for that control being given back to people like Diddy and Bad Boy was, you got to change some of this content. It can't be what it was in the early 90s, right? And so, after NWA and so-called gangster rap, there's a shift in terms of sort of thrust. But, even that is uneven, right? And so, people like Russell Simmons and others, a lot of them emerge, out of what's happening in terms of what people like Howard were trying to accomplish with the hip hop conferences. I think that's another book that somebody should write, because I think it'll help us understand really what happens in the transition from, the music in the 1980s and what happens in the 1990s. Right. You get the shiny suits and things like that. Right. But that's Black Media Force, right? The reason that Raz is on the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, that's the teacher. Right. That's all connected, right? You know about Diddy, but there's a whole range of folks. Two Things in the Cipher, all of those folks. Brother Ron Amin-Ra Lawrence. Like, there's so many people that were in those circles that then would go and transform the music. Right. And still are, many of them.
You mentioned you were there in 2009. Looking back on this moment, when you're at Howard in 2009, and then looking back on it in 2020 after you've written this book, what's the legacy of that moment? And why don't more people know the story about that particular moment?
I would say that there's a way that you can talk about the 1960s where it's no longer a threat.
Yeah.
Right. And there are a number of people that have written about, the memories and how memory works in terms of the history of civil rights and Black power. In many ways, it's not a threat to this moment to write about it now. 1989 is still a threat.
Absolutely.
Why? Because we know how the the Democratic Party, as a representative of the liberal mainstream, responds to that particular moment. It's not the response of the Black students, obviously. It's not even the response of the Black elite who would come within the orbit of the Democratic Party, right? So that chapter on, when they asked me to write a chapter on Jesse Jackson and his campaigns, that's extremely important, because the students, young people during that era, had every expectation that Jesse Jackson and that ilk within the progressive element of the Democratic Party would go with them. That didn't happen. Instead, we got Clinton and the neoliberal sort of centrist vision of the Democratic Party. And exposing that, thinking about that in terms of those contradictions, that's still a threat, because that threat still exists in the same way.
Right.
So 89 still feels too new. It hasn't been evacuated as, okay, well, we can reframe this now, right? And so the reason that you don't have, I think, the reason that you don't have many more studies on Black radicalism and Black student activism in the 80s and 90s is because the same struggles, in many ways, the formation of those struggles with the neoliberal era, it still exists as a powerful impediment to radical and revolutionary movements today. And so I think hopefully more people will write about that moment, because I do think it's probably more appropriate to compare the struggles, for instance, of the Black Lives Matter movement to its immediate predecessors that are lurching back to the 60s and saying, those are the elders. Well, what about Generation X in terms of their eldership? Right. That's a different conversation.
Right. The precursor to the Trayvon generation is not the Emmett generation, but it's the Yusef Hawkins generation. Right. Yeah, no, I got you. What was the one thing that came up in your research in this book that quite frankly just shocked or surprised you, that you were surprised to find out?
Wow, one thing. I mean, there are a number of things, but I think perhaps the one thing that shocked or surprised me was how progressive and open they were to the leadership of Black women. Something happened between the late 1960s, when, of course, there were still struggles against this, and Black women were still able to assert themselves in really important ways. But something happened between then and the hip hop generation where obviously sexism was not eliminated, but it wasn't a storyline to have a Black woman in power. Meaning it felt natural in some ways. And I can only speak to that. I've only studied that in the context of Howard, but that actually did surprise me. The Houston president, one of the earlier Student Association presidents, Ona Austin, was a really important figure, a radical Black woman who led the student body. I probably shouldn't say too much about her. She now works at Brookings. And there might be a problem with her knowing about her meeting with Gaddafi in 1986, but I'll say it anyway. That's really important that, you have students going to meet Gaddafi, at a moment where the United States had branded him as a terrorist. And of course, the same thing's true of the Southern Africans, right? They were all considered terrorists. But when April Silver was nominated as the leader, that foresight probably is one of the reasons that any success that the protest had was successful, because she had this gentle spirit that was necessary to actually get change, to make change. It's the difference between her at the negotiating table and Ras Baraka at the negotiating table. Ras at the time wasn't the Ras of the mayor of Newark today. Ras was, put it quite frankly, right? According to everybody that I spoke to, he didn't have the right spirit. April had the right spirit. And so when she actually takes the mic away from Bill Cosby, which is Bill Cosby, but he was an icon in 1989, right?
Right.
Whatever you say after that moment, it better be profound. And so her visibility and her presence as a Black woman was something that I deeply respected. And one of the reasons that I named the book after her quote, "We are worth fighting for." And then one of the reasons I began the book with her conversation with her mentor, none other than Sonia Sanchez. And so I guess it's not surprising, but it's something that I think was affirming for me to see the centrality of Black women. And if I talk about April Silver, I have to talk about Cherie Warren, who is now a principal of a school in the Bronx. But she was the organizer, right? She actually, she grew up in a very tough situation in the Bronx, and somehow or another made it to Howard and didn't have any money. And so she actually worked and organized and went to school. And she was actually working during the protests. And so she said that after those 4 days, I actually slept for 24 hours straight. And so she was in many ways, the organizing force. You know, April Silver was the public face and the public spirit of it. But right. Cherie Warren is really master organizer who made everything move, made everything flow. And so the idea of Black women as leaders, something that you see as a complicated legacy of hip hop generation. But at Howard, it was very present. It was very powerful.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. You've been watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We've been joined today by Professor Joshua M. Myers, who's Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Howard University. He's the author of the new book, We Are Worth Fighting For, A History of Howard University Student Protests of 1989, published by NYU Press. We're label mates, Josh.
Yeah.
But thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely, anytime.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black.